Hello and welcome back to The Explainer. I have to say, I am absolutely thrilled to share this particular topic with you all today. We're going to be looking at this profound intersection that honestly often gets completely overlooked in mainstream conversations. We are talking about how interactive storytelling isn't just mindless entertainment. It is actually a powerful, dynamic engine for personal development, for building deep empathy, and for cultivating what we might even call metaphysical resilience. By the time we wrap up today, we are going to look really closely at how the media we choose to engage with doesn't just pass the time. It actively, fundamentally shapes who we become. So here is our roadmap for how we're going to unpack this today. We'll be moving through 6 key stages, starting with the illusion of simplicity, then moving into subverting the hero's quest and confronting systemic injustice. From there, we'll look at the burden of choice, the mechanics of resilience, and we will finally bring it all together with transformation and advocacy.
All right, let's kick things off with part 1, the illusion of simplicity.
Think about what we could call the ordinary world. Growing up in a standard, quiet, suburban environment, differences between people were often, quietly discouraged. Morality was treated as this highly reliable, incredibly simple binary. It was just good versus bad, us versus them, cops and robbers. Very clean, right? And in that ordinary world, video games were generally just a comfortable escape from doing your homework. You beat the level, you collect your little digital reward, you save the princess, and you move on with your day. There were absolutely zero expectations that a piece of media, a game, could demand actual philosophical growth from you. But Tales of Symphonia completely shattered that baseline assumption. It didn't just offer a fun weekend, it demanded complex narrative engagement and asked players to actively, critically question corrupt established institutions. Because, early gaming felt like such simple digital victories. You sit in the dark, you're bathed in the glow of the television, you're escaping your reality, and there is zero moral weight attached to your actions. You defeat an enemy, they vanish into thin air, and that's it. But discovering this game was a massive, unexpected catalyst. What started out looking like a standard, breezy, colorful fantasy adventure turned into a rigorous 80-hour education in disguise. It's kind of brilliant how it worked. The battles were fast, they were kinetic, they drew the player in with all the flashing lights and fun mechanics. But the story stubbornly refused to stay simple. It was this exact, pivotal moment where play stopped being just an escape and actually became the groundwork for a massive, lifelong ideological shift. Moving right along, let's jump into part 2, subverting the hero's quest, and see how this builds. You've got this beautiful fantasy map, and it's promising you a clear, righteous, chosen one path, where the good guys save the day and everybody cheers. We all know this trope, right? But the hidden reality of the game's universe was so much darker than anyone anticipated. It turns out that 2 distinct civilizations, Sylvarant and tetha'alla, were actually locked in this hidden zero-sum competition for sheer survival. They were essentially sharing the same life force, meaning prosperity for one civilization literally, mathematically, meant violent suffering and decay for the other. So that standard, comfortable, go save the world quest we've seen in 100 different stories, it was a total illusion. And what it was hiding were these incredibly rigid, heavily guarded structures of power that thrived on that very imbalance. This meant the so-called world regeneration mission the player thought they were on, the grand, heroic destiny, was a complete and total lie. It was entirely engineered by those holding the reins of power. Now, for a young player, think about how world-tilting that realization is. The game is telling you that authority, even literal divine authority, angels descending from the sky, could be entirely corrupt. And worst, the noble hero you're controlling was actively being used as a pawn in a rigged game. It taught a highly theoretically grounded, absolutely crucial lesson. You must learn to question the quest itself, not just the villain you are pointing your sword at. It's asking who gave you this objective in the first place and who benefits if you succeed. Which brings us to a really heavy section. Part 3, confronting systemic injustice. The game doesn't pull its punches here. Institutional racism was rendered explicitly in the game's glittering, wealthy imperial city of Meltokio. In this society, half-elves were legally treated as second-class citizens. They were denied fundamental rights, they were denied basic dignity, and they were constantly surveilled by institutions that proudly called themselves civilized and advanced. The game was literally naming the unspoken hierarchies of our real world. For a player from a quiet suburb where prejudice often wore a very polite, quiet mask, this forced a direct, unavoidable confrontation with systemic inequality. And it did this brilliantly through core party members like Rain and Gennis, half-elven siblings whose daily struggle for survival was the actual moral center of the story. The player wasn't just reading about this. They were forced to witness and empathize with prejudice from the inside out, protecting characters they had grown to love. And then, inside a location called the Cybec Research Center, the narrative takes an even darker turn. Suddenly, you discover that DNA testing is being used as a literal weapon of state power. People are being coldly cataloged and controlled entirely by their birth and their genetics. This wasn't just another fun fantasy dungeon to clear for experience points and loot. It was a rigorous direct metaphor for eugenics. It held this highly polished, incredibly uncomfortable mirror up to real-world societal flaws, showing the violent bureaucratic sorting of human beings. And it leaves the player wrestling with a massive, haunting question. How do we, in our real lives, consciously or unconsciously, participate in systems that rank human value?
This leads us directly into Part 4, the burden of choice.
Neutrality is a choice, and it belongs to the oppressor. I really want us to just sit with that for a second. This demands a critical analysis of our own assumptions about keeping the peace or staying out of politics. The game delivered this lesson not just through some profound character dialogue, but through the actual mechanics of playing it. To progress the story, you had to physically choose to act. Standing still, playing it safe, keeping your head down, and refusing to pick a side, that meant silently accepting a system built entirely on someone else's suffering. It forces you to realize that doing nothing is actually doing something very destructive. Because inaction is itself a political stance. And the hard truth the game presents is that there is no clean, easy path that leaves everyone perfectly happy. The player quickly learned that the antagonistic factions, the Decians and Cruxes, weren't simply evil, cackling monsters plotting in a volcano lair. They were vast, bureaucratic systems of power, sustained by people who genuinely believed in their own righteousness. Fighting them meant confronting the very logic of supremacy itself, and doing that permanently dismantled those inherited, clean, binary moral frameworks we talked about earlier. It forced the player to step up and make tough calls in the face of deep, messy ambiguity.
All right, let's pivot slightly and look at how the game design supports this in Part 5, the mechanics of resilience.
Now, what is really interesting here is how perfectly standard role-playing game design maps directly to the human spirit. Think about it. Tanking a massive sword slash in a game, that translates to enduring massive emotional and spiritual blows in the real world. Relying on healing gels and taking the time to level up your stats, that represents internal identity transformations, self-care, and sheer willpower. And plot armor, the reason the main character just refuses to die, that is metaphysical resilience. It's the idea that digital mechanics become profound structural metaphors for human willpower. It proves that what we practice in these virtual constructed spaces can deeply, profoundly inform our real-world endurance. Take the game's protagonist, for example, Lloyd Irving. In the reality of the game's lore, he's literally just a teenage blacksmith's kid. He wields a pair of swords, and he's pushing his way into a massive conflict with literal angels, demigods, and magical prodigies. Realistically, he should be killed instantly by the first heavily armed soldier he meets. But he survives. Why? Because his determination is a literal, coded stat. He isn't just lucky, his spirit is custom-built for a world where courage has literal, measurable gravity and power. He is strong precisely because the world bends around his fierce, unwavering resolve. And this connects directly back to you, the viewer. Lloyd gets his invincibility through game mechanics that grant him physical armor and health points. But we, navigating the complexities of the real world, develop what the source material beautifully calls angelic durability. These are our spiritual mechanics, granting us deep emotional resilience. Think about it for a second. Stepping into roles in your life that you supposedly shouldn't survive, or facing real-life antagonists that should have broken you, works on a remarkably similar mythic logic. Surviving real-world trauma mirrors this game logic, where your purpose and your transformed identity grant you actual, tangible power to endure whatever is thrown at you.
Finally, let's bring it all home with Part 6, Transformation and Advocacy.
Reaching the endgame wasn't just about gaining maximum power or getting the best weapons. It was the ultimate culmination of perspective. It required holding massive, painful contradictions together without collapsing them into an easy, comforting answer. And there is a real heavy cost to this knowledge. Once you see how a caste system works, once you see how institutions sustain themselves on the backs of others, you completely lose the luxury of looking away. You have to accept that while you must fight to dismantle zero-sum logic, some scars from the journey are absolutely permanent. The world that gets saved still requires constant, exhausting, everyday vigilance to stay saved. Through all of this, players walked away with 3 defining identity truths. First, they learned what it means to become a question asker, someone who constantly examines the highly dangerous comfort of unexamined certainty. Second, they became a resonant chooser, deeply understanding that even your quietest, most private choices ripple outward into the lives of people you may never even meet. And third, they became a lifelong seeker, a person fundamentally committed to pursuing the truth in a complex society, especially, and most importantly, when that truth is deeply inconvenient. So zooming out, why does all of this matter? It matters because the game transformed passive observation into active advocacy. By playing through the eyes of characters who were feared and hunted simply for what they were born as, it created a deep, embodied form of empathy that honestly, no standard classroom lecture could ever produce. And these unspoken trophies of moral growth, they didn't stay locked inside the television console. They were carried forward into real-world school hallways, into intense family debates, and into community dynamics. They actively influenced who was included at the lunch table and who we finally found the courage to stand up for. Beating the game was only the beginning. The real quest never ends. I love that. The child who sat down in front of that glowing screen, maybe a little afraid of the unfamiliar, was transformed into someone genuinely different by the time the credits rolled. They became an advocate with moral clarity that was quite literally earned through play. Because the real trial, the real boss fight, is fought every single time we choose not to stay silent when we see exclusion and hierarchy playing out right in our own backyards. So, I want to leave you with this. Think about the stories you engage with on a daily basis. How is the media you consume quietly shaping your own spiritual armor? And how is it defining your real-world choices? It's like a giant puzzle, and it is a question absolutely worth carrying with you as you navigate your own quests. Keep seeking those inconvenient truths, and always, always keep questioning the quest. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. It's been an absolute blast, and I will see you next time.